9分. The dust hung still over the plain near a place men would later call Zama, and on one side of that dust stood a man who had never lost a major battle in his life. He was looking at his own elephants. 80 of them, lined up in front of his army, tusks catching the early light, the ground already trembling under their weight, before they had even moved. For 16 years, the world had learned to fear this man. Roman senators had gone to bed at night hearing his name in their nightmares. 3 Roman armies had been destroyed by his mind alone, not just his soldiers. And now, on this open ground in North Africa, Hannibal Barca stood behind his strongest weapon, and something in his posture suggested he already knew it might not be enough. Across the field, the Roman lines were not arranged the way they usually were. There were gaps, open lanes running straight through the formation, like roads cut deliberately into a wall. Any veteran of the Italian campaigns would have looked at that and seen a mistake, an invitation, a formation begging to be broken by exactly the kind of charge Hannibal was about to unleash. It was not a mistake, it was a memory. Because the man commanding those Roman lines had spent years studying Hannibal the way a younger brother studies an older one, he is determined to surpass. He had read every report of every battle. He had asked the survivors of Cannae what they had seen in the final moments, when the trap closed around them and there was nowhere left to run. He had listened and waited, and built something out of that listening that no one had used against Hannibal before. This is the story of the day. Rome finally learned how to beat the man who taught them what real defeat looked like. Not through luck, not through numbers, through the patient, almost unbearable discipline of turning an enemy's greatest weapon against itself. By the end of this day, the war that had burned for 17 years would be over. An empire that once dreamed of replacing Rome would never threaten it again. And the man who had crossed the Alps with elephants, who had broken 3 Roman armies in 3 years, who had marched through Italy for over a decade while Rome could do nothing but watch, would walk off this field having lost the only battle that mattered. He would not blame fortune. He would not blame his men. According to the ancient writers who recorded what came after, he would do something almost no undefeated general in history has ever done. He would look at the wreckage of his own army, accept what had happened, and tell his own people to surrender. To understand how that moment came to exist, we have to go back further than the battlefield. We have to go back to the years when nobody in Rome believed they had a man capable of meeting Hannibal as an equal, and a young officer with no great reputation was quietly given a command in Spain that everyone else considered hopeless. For most of his life, Publius Cornelius Scipio had been defined by loss. His father and his uncle, both experienced commanders, had been killed years apart fighting Carthaginian forces in Spain. The Roman war effort there had been struggling for years, bleeding resources with little to show for it. When Scipio volunteered to take command after the deaths of his relatives, the decision to grant him that command had less to do with confidence in his ability and more to do with the simple fact that no one else wanted the job. Spain, by then, looked like a lost cause to the men who actually understood war. Scipio was young for the responsibility. He had not yet built the reputation that would later make his name a synonym for victory. What he had, instead, was patience and an unusual willingness to study failure rather than run from it. Between 211 and 206 BC, he did something that most generals of his era never managed. He learned from his enemies instead of simply fighting them. He studied how Hannibal's brothers and the Carthaginian commanders in Spain used cavalry to disrupt Roman formations. He studied how flexible troop movements could turn what looked like a straightforward infantry clash into an envelopment. And at the Battle of Illapa, in 206 BC, he applied lessons drawn directly from watching how Hannibal himself had broken Roman armies in Italy, reversing the roles so completely that Carthaginian power in Spain was shattered for good. It is worth sitting with that detail for a moment, because it is easy to rush past it. The man who would eventually defeat Hannibal began his career by copying him. Not the elephants, not the crossing of mountains, The deeper lesson underneath all of it, the idea that a smaller, more disciplined force could destroy a larger one if the larger one could be made to fight on terms it did not choose. Scipio absorbed that idea in Spain, refined it, and carried it home to Rome, along with a reputation that was finally beginning to match his ambition. By 205 BC, Scipio was consul, and he had a plan that struck most of the Roman Senate as reckless, bordering on insane. For 16 years, Hannibal had been loose in Italy. Roman strategy had mostly consisted of avoiding him, wearing him down through attrition, refusing the kind of open battle that had cost Rome so dearly at Cannae. It had worked. In the sense that Rome was still standing, it had also meant that the war showed no sign of actually ending. Hannibal could not be dislodged from Italian soil by waiting him out forever. Scipio's idea was different. Instead of trying to force Hannibal out of Italy, he proposed taking the war directly to Carthage itself. If Rome threatened the Carthaginian homeland in North Africa, Carthage would have no choice but to recall its greatest general from Italy to defend it. It was a gamble built on a very specific kind of confidence, the belief that Scipio could face Carthaginian forces on their own continent and win decisively enough to force the issue. The Senate was divided. Some saw genius. Others saw a young commander with something to prove, willing to risk everything Rome had built over 16 brutal years on an invasion that could just as easily end in disaster. Scipio got his command anyway. What almost nobody in Rome understood at the time was that the success of this invasion would not depend on Roman legions alone. It would depend on a king who, at that exact moment, had only 200 horsemen left to his name. His name was Massinissa, and 3 years before Scipio's invasion of Africa, he was not a king at all in any meaningful sense. He was a fugitive. Massinissa belonged to the Massiliae, an eastern Numidian people whose homeland bordered Carthaginian territory. As a young man, he had been raised partly in Carthage itself, absorbing its culture even as his own people remained, at least nominally, independent allies of the Carthaginian state. He had fought for Carthage in Spain in his youth, leading Numidian cavalry against Roman forces with real skill. For a time, his future seemed secured by that alliance. Then politics intervened, the way it so often does in stories that end in tragedy. A rival Numidian king named Syphax, ruler of the more powerful Western Numidian Confederation, became entangled with Carthage through marriage and ambition. When Massinissa's father died, a succession dispute opened the door for Syphax to seize Massinissa's homeland, driving the young prince out with nothing but a handful of loyal riders. For roughly 2 years, Massinissa survived as something between a guerrilla leader and a bandit, hiding in disputed borderlands, raiding caravans to stay alive, watching his kingdom ruled by a man who had once been merely a rival and was now, effectively, an extension of Carthaginian power in the region. It would have been easy, at that point, for Massinissa to simply disappear from history. A minor prince, betrayed and exiled, fading into irrelevance the way so many minor princes did in the ancient world. Instead, he made a calculation that would change the outcome of the entire war. He had watched Carthaginian power collapse in Spain. He had seen Roman legions, under this same young commander Scipio, grind down Carthaginian forces year after year until there was nothing left to hold the peninsula. And from that, Massinissa drew a conclusion that many of his contemporaries were still unwilling to accept. Rome was going to win this war. Carthage's defeat was not a possibility. It was a direction already in motion. So Massinissa did something that required a particular kind of courage, the courage of someone who has already lost everything and has nothing left to protect by staying loyal to people who never protected him. He reached out to Scipio and offered an alliance. If Rome would help him reclaim his throne, he would bring Numidian cavalry to support the invasion of Africa. When Scipio finally crossed to North Africa in 204 BC, the army he brought with him was substantial on paper. Multiple sources suggest a force of roughly 25,000 infantry and several thousand cavalry, transported across the sea on a fleet of warships and transports. But waiting for him on the African shore was not the king he had been promised. It was a man with 200 horsemen, all that remained of an army that had once commanded thousands. It would have been reasonable for Scipio to wonder if he had made a terrible mistake. He did not abandon the alliance, and that decision to keep faith with an exiled king who had almost nothing left to offer in the moment they actually met would turn out to be one of the most important strategic choices in the entire war. Because what Massinissa lacked in numbers, he made up for in something far more valuable: knowledge of the terrain, knowledge of his enemy Syphax, and the kind of personal motivation that comes from a man fighting to reclaim everything that was taken from him. Over the following months, that 200-man force began to grow. Scipio and Massinissa fought together against Syphax and the Carthaginian forces supporting him, winning a series of engagements that slowly eroded Carthaginian power in the region. The most decisive of these came at the Battle of the Great Plains in 203 BC, where the combined Roman-Numidian force broke Syphax's army so completely that Syphax himself was eventually captured. With his rival removed, Massinissa's own following swelled, drawing in warriors who had been waiting to see which side would actually win before committing themselves. There is a human story tangled inside this military one, and the ancient sources treat it as inseparable from the larger war, even if modern historians treat parts of it with caution. Massinissa, in the aftermath of defeating Syphax, found himself drawn to Sophonisba, the Carthaginian noblewoman who had been Syphax's wife. According to the tradition recorded by later Roman writers, the two were married almost immediately, a decision driven as much by political logic as by personal feeling. Scipio, however, did not trust her. He feared that a Carthaginian noblewoman married into the Numidian royal house might pull Massinissa's loyalty back toward Carthage at the exact moment Rome needed him most. He demanded that Sophonisba be sent to Rome to be displayed in a triumphal procession, a humiliation that would have stripped her of all dignity. Massinissa, unable to refuse Scipio outright without breaking the alliance that had restored his kingdom, chose a different path. He sent Sophonisba a vial of poison, allowing her to take her own life rather than face that public humiliation. Modern historians treat parts of this story with appropriate caution. Ancient writers loved a tragic romance, and some details may have been shaped for dramatic effect over the generations before they were written down. What is not in dispute is the outcome that mattered for the coming battle. Massinissa remained loyal to Rome, his Numidian cavalry remained intact, and Scipio had secured exactly the kind of ally he needed for the confrontation that was now approaching. While Scipio built this alliance in North Africa, the pressure on Carthage itself was becoming unbearable. By 203 BC, Scipio had already won a battle barely 20 miles from the city of Carthage, close enough that the Carthaginian Senate could likely see the smoke from their own walls. The war that had once seemed safely contained in distant Italy and Spain was now knocking directly on the home city's door. Faced with the prospect of losing everything, Carthage made the only call that still made sense to them. They recalled Hannibal after 16 years in Italy, after Trebia, after Lake Trasimene, after the catastrophe of Cannae that had killed tens of thousands of Roman soldiers in a single day. Hannibal was ordered home. His brother Mago, who had been fighting a separate campaign in northern Italy, was recalled as well, though Mago would not survive the journey. Wounded in earlier fighting near Liguria, he died at sea during the crossing back to Africa, never living to see the final battle his brother would fight. For Hannibal, the order to return must have carried a strange, bitter weight. He had spent 16 years proving that Roman territory was not safe, that Roman armies could be destroyed, that the entire foundation of Roman military confidence could be shattered by patience and tactical brilliance. He had done everything a general could reasonably be asked to do. And none of it had been enough to actually win the war, because Rome had simply refused to fight him on the terms he wanted, absorbing blow after blow rather than collapsing the way every other power in the ancient world would have. Now he was being called home not as a conqueror but as a defender, asked to protect the very city that had sent him to Italy in the first place, against an enemy that had learned, in his absence, exactly how to hurt him. The army Hannibal brought back to Africa was not the army that had crossed the Alps. Most of his original veterans, the men who had marched with him from the beginning, had been lost over 16 years of relentless campaigning. What he had instead, when he combined his returning forces with what Carthage could scrape together locally, was a mixture. A hardened core of veterans who had survived the Italian campaign, supplemented by mercenaries from Gaul, Liguria, and Iberia, along with newly raised local levies who had never faced a Roman legion in their lives. It is one of the more overlooked details of this entire war. The Hannibal who arrived to fight the final decisive battle of his career was commanding an army that, in significant part, did not yet know what it was like to fight Romans. The terror that Roman soldiers felt at the mention of his name was not matched by an equivalent terror among many of his own troops toward what they were about to face. There was another problem, one that would prove even more consequential than inexperience. Hannibal had crossed the Alps with elephants in 218 BC, and the image of those animals navigating snow and ice had become part of his legend. But the cavalry that had supported his campaigns, the horses that had given Carthaginian forces such devastating mobility throughout the war, could not all be brought back across the sea. Limited shipping space forced difficult choices, and many of his horses were left behind or simply could not survive the journey. At the same time, the defeat of Syphax had dried up what had once been Carthage's most reliable source of skilled Numidian cavalry, since Syphax's kingdom had supplied riders to the Carthaginian cause for years. Hannibal would arrive in Africa for the final battle of his life, with a serious cavalry disadvantage, against an enemy whose cavalry had only grown stronger through exactly the alliance he had lost. What he did have, in larger numbers than he had ever fielded before, was elephants. 80 of them, according to the most widely accepted ancient accounts, gathered and prepared in the months before the final confrontation. Modern historians still debate why Carthage was unable to field a fully trained force given the time available, but what seems clear is that Hannibal made a deliberate choice to delay seeking battle in order to give these animals additional preparation, believing they could compensate for what his army lacked elsewhere. It was a reasonable gamble, given what he had to work with. It would also turn out to be the decision that handed Scipio exactly the tactical problem he had spent years preparing to solve. Because while Hannibal trained his elephants, Scipio was positioning his own forces with a patience that bordered on stubbornness. He marched up the Bagradas River Valley, the agricultural heartland that fed Carthage itself, forcing Hannibal to abandon any thought of fighting near the coast and march inland to meet him. Scipio chose ground that favored open maneuver, ground where cavalry could operate freely, ground that, not coincidentally, played directly to the strength he now possessed in Massinissa's Numidian horsemen. By the time Hannibal's forces reached the area, Scipio had already secured the position. The man who had spent 16 years choosing exactly where and when to fight Rome now found himself, for the first time, fighting on ground someone else had selected. Before the armies clashed, the two generals did something that the ancient sources treat as one of the most extraordinary moments of the entire war. They met in person. According to the accounts that survive, Hannibal requested the meeting, likely hoping that face-to-face negotiation might secure better terms than continued fighting would allow. He may have sensed, even before the battle began, that the conditions did not favor him. Scipio, for his part, may simply have been curious to finally see, up close, the man whose name had haunted Roman nightmares for nearly 2 decades. They could not speak to each other directly. Though both men were fluent in Greek, the shared language of educated elites across the Mediterranean world, they chose instead to speak through their own native tongues, Scipio in Latin and Hannibal in Punic, relying on interpreters to carry their words back and forth. It is a small detail, easy to overlook, but it captures something true about the moment. Even at the edge of peace, neither man was willing to meet the other entirely on the other's terms. The ancient historians who recorded this meeting also gave each man a speech, full of reflection on fortune, on the dangers of overconfidence, on the strange symmetry between Hannibal's past glories and Scipio's present position. Modern historians treat these speeches with real skepticism. The meeting itself likely happened. The exact words exchanged were almost certainly shaped, embellished, or partly invented by later writers crafting a dramatic scene for a dramatic moment in history. What we can say with more confidence is the outcome. Hannibal proposed terms, Scipio rejected them, and both men understood, as they returned to their camps, that the matter would now be settled. The only way old quarrels this large were ever truly settled: by force. The next day, both armies arranged themselves on the open ground Scipio had chosen, and what happened next would decide, in a matter of hours, the fate of two civilizations that had been locked in conflict for nearly 2 decades. To understand why this particular arrangement of troops mattered so much, we need to look closely at something easy to miss if you are not watching for it: the empty spaces in the Roman line. A typical Roman battle formation arranged its infantry in tight blocks, units called maniples standing close together to present a solid, unbroken wall to the enemy. It was a formation built for stability, for mutual support, for the kind of disciplined cohesion that had made Roman infantry feared across the Mediterranean. On this particular morning, Scipio broke that pattern deliberately. Between his maniples he left open lanes, gaps wide enough for something very large to pass straight through the Roman line without being forced to collide with it. To any Carthaginian officer studying the Roman formation from across the field, this likely looked like an opportunity, perhaps even a mistake. A gap in an enemy line is usually something you exploit, not something you should be afraid of. But these gaps were not weaknesses. They were corridors, built with a very specific purpose in mind, aimed at neutralizing the one weapon Hannibal had spent months preparing. Scipio placed his light infantry, the velites, at the head of these lanes, with explicit instructions. When the elephants charged, the velites were not meant to stand and fight them. They were meant to retreat through the openings, drawing the animals forward into empty corridors that ran straight through the Roman formation rather than into it, then peel off to the sides and let the beasts continue harmlessly onward, away from the men who would actually decide the battle. It is worth pausing here to understand why this particular solution mattered so much beyond the immediate tactical problem of war elephants. War elephants were terrifying, not primarily because of what they could physically do to a soldier, though that danger was real enough. They were terrifying because of what they did to discipline. An elephant charge created chaos, noise, and panic was the one force capable of unraveling formations that had held firm against ordinary attacks. Hannibal himself understood this. It is part of why he had delayed battle to train these animals in the first place, hoping their psychological weight alone might be enough to break the Roman line before real fighting even began. Scipio's lanes addressed the psychological problem directly. By giving the elephants somewhere to go that was not into a wall of Roman soldiers, he removed the chaos before it could spread. There would be no panic, because there would be nothing for the elephants to actually crash into. This is the detail at the center of everything the title of this story is built around. Not some lost piece of advanced engineering, not a secret machine no one had ever seen. A formation. A pattern of empty space, carefully designed, built from years of studying exactly what made elephant charges so devastating and exactly what kind of structure could absorb that devastation without breaking. It was, in its own way, more dangerous to Hannibal than any single piece of equipment could have been, because there was no obvious way to counter it. You cannot retrain 80 elephants overnight to charge differently. You cannot unlearn months of preparation in the hours before a battle. Scipio had built a trap not out of new technology, but out of the patient, unglamorous work of understanding his enemy more deeply than his enemy understood the battlefield in front of him. As the two armies finished arranging themselves, the deeper structure of Scipio's formation became clear. The Italian cavalry took position on the left wing. On the right, Massinissa and his Numidian horsemen, the same force that had grown from 200 desperate riders into a body strong enough to anchor an entire flank of the Roman army. Behind the gapped maniples stood the rest of the legions in their traditional three lines: Hastati, Principes, and Triarii, veterans included among them, some of whom had survived the disaster at Cannae years earlier, and carried into this battle a very personal need for redemption. Across the field, Hannibal arranged his own forces in three lines as well, though the composition told its own story about the army he was actually commanding. The front line consisted of mercenaries, men from Gaul, Liguria, and Iberia, fighting for pay rather than homeland. Behind them stood Carthaginian and African levies, troops with less combat experience than the soldiers Rome had brought to the field. And, in the rear, held back as the final decisive reserve, stood Hannibal's veterans, the survivors of the Italian campaign, the only men in his entire army who had actually faced and beaten Roman legions before. It was, in effect, three different armies stacked behind each other, with the most reliable troops kept furthest from the initial danger. In front of all of them stood the elephants. According to the accounts that survive, as the two sides closed the final distance, Numidian cavalry skirmishers had already begun exchanging long-range attacks, the kind of probing engagement that often preceded a larger battle. Then Hannibal gave the order, and the elephants began to move forward, gathering speed across the open ground toward the waiting Roman line. What happened next would decide everything. According to the surviving accounts, the Romans met the charge not with silence, but with noise, a coordinated blast of trumpets and horns timed to the elephants' advance. The sound, amplified by the open terrain and the sheer number of instruments sounding at once, appears to have done exactly what Scipio likely hoped it would do. Several of the elephants, particularly on the Carthaginian left flank, panicked and turned, not toward the Roman line, but backward into their own cavalry. It is one of the more striking reversals in ancient military history, and it deserves a moment of genuine attention because it captures something larger than this single battle. A weapon built entirely around inspiring fear became, in an instant, a source of fear for the side that had brought it onto the field. The animals trampled through the Numidian and Moorish cavalry units stationed behind them, disrupting formations before those units had even begun to fight, throwing the Carthaginian flank into disorder before the battle had properly started. Not every elephant turned. Some did continue their charge directly into the Roman line, and where they did, Scipio's lanes did exactly what they had been designed to do. The animals ran straight through the gaps, harassed along the way by javelins thrown from the velites stationed in the openings, but never finding the dense wall of bodies that would have let them do the kind of damage Hannibal had hoped for. They passed through the Roman formation and continued onward into open ground beyond it, their charge spent without having broken anything. The single greatest tactical innovation Hannibal had prepared for this battle had been neutralized within minutes, not through some miraculous countermeasure, but through patient preparation that had anticipated exactly this moment. The chaos on the Carthaginian left created an opportunity, and the Roman and Numidian cavalry on that side seized it immediately. With Carthaginian cavalry already disrupted by their own panicked elephants, the Roman allied horsemen attacked and quickly began to drive them from the field. On the other flank, a similar pattern emerged. Massinissa's Numidian cavalry engaged the remaining Carthaginian horsemen, and, after a hard-fought clash, broke them as well, sending them fleeing across the open plain with Roman and Numidian riders in pursuit. Within a relatively short span of time, both Carthaginian flanks had lost their cavalry entirely. They were not destroyed, not in this initial phase. They were chased off the field, scattered, no longer present to influence what was about to become a purely infantry struggle. This created a strange, almost eerie pause in the battle. Two cavalry forces, the most mobile element on either side, had effectively removed themselves from the immediate fight, racing across the landscape in pursuit and retreat, leaving behind two masses of infantry that now had to settle the matter without them. What remained on the field was the hardest part of any ancient battle. Men standing close enough to smell each other's fear, deciding the war with iron and muscle and whatever discipline they had left. The first line of Roman hastati advanced into Hannibal's front line of mercenaries, and the fighting that followed was brutal, in the way that ancient close combat always was. Men pressed shoulder to shoulder, advancing and retreating in waves, as each side tried to find weakness in the other's formation. The mercenaries fought with the particular desperation of men who had nothing waiting for them back home if they failed. No homeland, no families nearby, nothing but the pay they had been promised, and whatever survival instinct kept their arms moving. For a time, the fighting held roughly even. The mercenaries were skilled soldiers in their own right, hardened by years of campaigning. But something began to happen that revealed the deeper structural problem with Hannibal's army. As the mercenary line began to give ground, falling back under sustained Roman pressure, they expected support from the second line behind them, the Carthaginian and African levies, who were supposed to reinforce or relieve them. That support did not come the way it should have. According to the surviving accounts, the second line either hesitated or failed to advance in coordination with the retreating mercenaries, and the result was confusion at exactly the moment when cohesion mattered most. What followed was almost as damaging to Carthage as the Roman attack itself. Some of the retreating mercenaries, furious at what looked like abandonment by the very army they were fighting to protect, turned their weapons on the Carthaginian troops behind them. For a brief, chaotic period, men who were supposed to be allies were fighting each other in the middle of the largest battle of their lives, while Roman soldiers pressed forward into the confusion. It is the kind of detail that rarely makes it into simplified versions of this story, but it matters enormously, because it reveals something true about Hannibal's army that no elephant or cavalry formation could fix. An army built from disparate mercenary groups, hastily combined with inexperienced local levies, lacked the deep trust that comes only from years of fighting together. Rome's legions, whatever their other weaknesses, were bound by that trust. Hannibal's army, in this single critical moment, was not. Hannibal, watching from his position with the veteran third line, made a hard decision. He ordered his veterans to hold their ground and refuse passage to the survivors fleeing from the chaos ahead, forcing the remnants of the first two lines to scatter to the flanks rather than retreat into his last reliable force. It was a brutal but understandable choice. The only troops left who could plausibly still win this battle were the men who had survived Italy with him, and he could not afford to let them be disrupted by a wave of panicked, disorganized soldiers crashing into their formation. By the time the dust and bodies had settled enough to assess the situation, the first two Carthaginian lines were effectively gone, scattered, broken, no longer a coherent fighting force. What remained was the confrontation everyone watching that day had likely understood, on some level, was always going to be the real battle. Scipio's legions, exhausted but still standing, against Hannibal's veterans, the only men on the field who had actually defeated Roman armies before. According to Polybius, the ground between the two remaining forces had become almost impossible to cross cleanly, littered with the dead and slick with blood from the fighting that had already taken place. Scipio reportedly took the time to reorganize his exhausted troops before pressing the final assault, pulling his hastati back and reforming a single unified line, drawing the Principes and Triarii forward to stand alongside them rather than holding them in reserve. It was, in its own way, one final tactical adjustment, a recognition that the coming clash would require every disciplined soldier he had left, arranged not in layered reserves, but in a single combined wall, facing Hannibal's veterans directly. What followed was the longest and most evenly matched fighting of the entire day. Hannibal's veterans were not mercenaries fighting for pay, and they were not inexperienced levies fighting for the first time. They were men who had crossed the Alps, who had survived Cannae from the winning side, who had spent 16 years learning exactly how to kill Roman soldiers and exactly how to survive doing it. Whatever else had gone wrong for Carthage that day, these men did not break easily. The historical record suggests the fighting here was close, brutal, and genuinely uncertain in its outcome for some time, a real contest between two armies that had each, in their own way, earned the right to call themselves the best soldiers of their age. And then, in the distance, came the sound that would decide the war. The Roman and Numidian cavalry, having spent the earlier part of the battle chasing the broken Carthaginian horsemen far from the main fighting, finally turned back. Massinissa and the Roman commander Laelius, recognizing that the cavalry battle had been won decisively enough to abandon further pursuit, brought their riders back toward the main infantry engagement still raging in the center. What they found, arriving from the rear, was Hannibal's veteran line locked in a desperate, exhausting struggle with Scipio's legions, every man on both sides already committed to the fight in front of him, with no reserves left on either side to respond to a new threat. The cavalry struck the rear of Hannibal's formation without warning. There is no need to dramatize this moment with invented details, because the simple military reality of what happened carries enough weight on its own. An infantry force fighting at full exertion against an equally matched enemy in front of them has almost no capacity to suddenly reorganize and defend against a mounted attack from behind. The veterans, who had survived 16 years of warfare, who had outlasted 2 entire collapsing lines of their own army that day, who had held the line against Roman legions in the hardest fighting most of them had ever experienced, were caught between Scipio's infantry pressing from the front and Massinissa's cavalry crashing in from the rear. There was no formation that could survive that combination, not even theirs. The veteran line, the last and best part of Hannibal's army, broke. What followed was less a battle than a collapse, the kind of moment in ancient warfare where organized resistance simply ends, and what remains is chaos, flight, and slaughter on a scale the earlier fighting had only hinted at. The most widely cited ancient figures suggest something in the range of 20,000 Carthaginian dead, with a similar number captured, against Roman losses that the same sources place at roughly 1,500. Modern historians treat these figures with appropriate caution, since ancient casualty counts were notoriously prone to exaggeration on one side and undercounting on the other. But even allowing for significant uncertainty in the precise numbers, the scale of the disparity tells its own story. This was not a narrow victory. It was a complete and overwhelming destruction of the Carthaginian army. Hannibal himself survived, escaping the collapse with a small group of companions, riding hard away from a battlefield that had just ended. In the span of a single day, everything he had spent his entire adult life building. He made his way to Hadrumetum, the main Carthaginian base along the coast, where he gathered what remained of his shattered forces. According to the surviving accounts, what he found there amounted to a few thousand infantry and a few hundred cavalry, the surviving fragments of an army that had numbered in the tens of thousands only days before. It is worth sitting, just for a moment, with what that must have felt like. This was a man who had never, in 16 years on Italian soil, suffered a defeat of this magnitude. He had lost battles before, in the smaller, grinding sense that all long wars involve setbacks. He had never lost everything in a single afternoon. He had never stood at the edge of a war he had spent his entire life fighting and understood with total clarity that it was already finished. According to the tradition recorded by ancient writers, Hannibal did something that very few undefeated legends in history have ever chosen to do. He did not insist on continuing the fight. He did not blame his soldiers or his allies or the gods or fortune. He looked honestly at what remained of his strength and advised the Carthaginian Senate to seek peace on whatever terms Rome was willing to offer. It is, in its own quiet way, one of the more remarkable moments in this entire story, easy to miss amid the drama of the battle itself. A man whose name had become synonymous with refusing to accept defeat, with finding a way to keep fighting against impossible odds, made the harder choice when the moment actually called for it. He told his own people the truth, even when the truth was unbearable. Scipio, for his part, did not pursue the war to its absolute final extreme. He marched his legions back toward Tunis, allowed his men to loot the abandoned Carthaginian camp, and waited as Carthage once again sent envoys seeking peace. Some accounts suggest Scipio's willingness to negotiate rather than press for the city's complete destruction was shaped, at least in part, by a very practical political fear. The worry that if the war dragged on much longer, the Senate back in Rome might replace him with another commander before he could claim the credit for finally ending it. While these negotiations were underway, one final piece of unfinished business intervened. Word reached Scipio that a Numidian force under Vermina, son of the defeated king Syphax, was marching to assist Carthage. A Roman force, largely composed of cavalry, intercepted and surrounded this army before it could reach the city. According to Livy, more than 16,000 Numidians were killed or captured in the engagement that followed, a final, brutal coda to a war that had already, in every meaningful sense, been decided days earlier. The peace terms that followed were severe, designed not merely to end the war, but to ensure that Carthage could never again pose this kind of threat to Rome. Carthage lost all territory outside Africa itself. Its navy was surrendered. A massive financial indemnity was imposed, payable over decades. And in perhaps the most politically significant clause of all, Carthage was forbidden from waging war, even in self-defense, without first obtaining Roman permission. That clause would matter enormously in the decades that followed, though its full consequences belong to a different story. For Massinissa, the outcome of Zama represented the complete reversal of everything that had defined his life only a few years earlier. The man who had arrived in Africa with 200 desperate horsemen was now confirmed as king, not just of his own original homeland, but of Syphax's former territory as well, uniting Numidian peoples who had been bitterly divided for generations. The peace treaty itself included specific protections for his position, a recognition by Rome that his cavalry had been as essential to victory as any Roman legion on the field. For Scipio, the rewards were immediate and lasting. He returned to Rome as the man who had finally done what no other Roman commander had managed in 17 years of war. The Senate awarded him the honorific title Africanus, making him the first Roman general in history to be granted a name commemorating a victory won outside of Italy itself. His triumph through the streets of Rome was, by every surviving account, among the grandest the city had ever staged. His tactics at Zama would be studied by military commanders for centuries afterward, a case study in how patient preparation and willingness to learn from an enemy could overcome even history's most feared general. For Hannibal, the path forward was far less clear and considerably more bitter. He survived the war, but the city he had returned to defend had little practical use for him in the aftermath of total defeat. He would eventually be driven into exile years later, spending his remaining years moving between foreign courts, advising other rulers who hoped, at various points, to use his talents against Rome once more. He never again commanded an army the way he had in Italy. The man who had once made Rome itself tremble spent his final years as a wanted exile, hunted across the Mediterranean by a power he had once come closer than anyone in history to destroying. If you've made it this far into this story, it's worth asking yourself a question that doesn't have an obvious answer. If you were Hannibal, standing on that field after the cavalry hit your rear and your veterans began to break, would you have kept fighting anyway? Or would you have made the same choice he did? There is no wrong answer to that question. It is simply worth sitting with for a moment, because it gets at something true about what made this particular defeat so different from every other moment in his career. What makes the Battle of Zama worth returning to centuries later is not simply that Rome won and Carthage lost. Wars end with winners and losers constantly throughout history, and most of those endings fade into footnotes within a generation. What makes this battle different is the shape of how that ending arrived. Hannibal did not lose because he grew careless, or because his genius suddenly evaporated, or because some flaw in his character finally caught up with him after years of success. The ancient historian Polybius himself, writing within living memory of the events, suggested that Hannibal did everything a general in his position could reasonably have done, given the disadvantages he was facing. He lost because the man across the field had spent years quietly absorbing the very lessons Hannibal had spent a career teaching the world, then turned a weapon Hannibal himself had popularized, the war elephant, an instrument of pure psychological terror, into nothing more than a predictable problem with a calculated solution. He lost because an exiled king with 200 horsemen turned out to matter more in the end than 80 trained elephants. He lost because the apprentice had finally, patiently, learned enough to surpass the teacher. There is something almost unbearably human in that. The idea that the people who eventually defeat us are so often the ones who studied us most closely, who took our own methods seriously enough to understand exactly where they could break. The plain near Zama is quiet now, its precise location still debated by historians more than 2,000 years later, its name itself possibly attached to the wrong patch of ground entirely by a writer working a century and a half after the actual fighting ended. The empire that Hannibal nearly broke went on to dominate the Mediterranean world for the next 600 years. The city he had returned home to defend would itself be destroyed by Rome within his own lifetime's shadow, though that, too, is a different story for a different day. What remains, when you strip away the legend and look only at what the evidence actually supports, is a single afternoon when the greatest general of his age discovered that even genius has a limit, and that limit is reached the moment someone studies you closely enough to turn your own greatest strength into the very thing that destroys you.